Welcome to Atlantic Council Front Page, the Atlantic Council's premier live platform for world leaders tackling today's challenges. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I couldn't be more delighted to welcome Oleksandra Matviichuk, a 2022 Nobel Peace Prize winner and human rights lawyer, to the Atlantic Council today. And we're hosting this under the auspices of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, where Ambassador John Herbst, former ambassador to Ukraine, and his team have been really taking a lead on all the issues regarding Ukraine for years already. I'm very proud of their work, and we're very proud to have you here as part of their work. Through your advocacy and your work with the organization, the Center for Civil Liberties, Oleksandra Matviichuk continues to raise global awareness of and encourage leaders around the world to take action against Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine. During the course of its war in Ukraine, the Russian military continues to commit war crimes, including torture, the use of chemical weapons, forced disappearance, the abduction and forced displacement of Ukraine's children, attacks on Ukraine's energy and civilian infrastructure, cultural heritage destruction and heritage theft, the severe repression of all religions other than the Moscow Patriarchate, and other egregious forms of highly illegal violence exercised against the people of Ukraine. It's the brave and extraordinary leaders like Ms. Matviichuk that have brought the Kremlin's violence to the forefront of the global stage as the Ukrainian people continue to suffer. Her years of dedicated work in human and civil rights have made her an unparalleled representative of the importance of securing Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. We're honored that she is also a member of this year's cohort of the Atlantic Council Millennium Leadership Fellows, a stellar group of international changemakers shaping the future. She's also been an exemplary advocate for Ukrainian human rights and civil liberties since before the Euromaidan, and especially during Russia's violent full-scale invasion. As members of the international community who must and will continue to support Ukraine's essential victory, we are honored to welcome Ms. Matviichuk to the Council today, especially around the anniversary of your receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. As well as pushing for and taking action for the people of Ukraine, you also demonstrate how Russia's violence poses a concrete threat to the safety and security of the world at large by being here. With partners like Iran, China, North Korea, Russia is deepening its tyrannical partnerships in tandem with its aggression in Ukraine, which is in itself an affront to democratic norms and the values of human rights that the U.S. and our allies work and have made sacrifices to protect. Today's discussion of these critical topics will be moderated by Julie Sirkin, congressional correspondent with NBC News. And Julie, it's wonderful to have you here as well. For those in the audience watching virtually today, submit any questions you have on askac.org, askac.org. And for those of you joining us in person, please feel free to use the mic stand to the left of the room. It's actually to your left and my right of the room. And we'll get to the questions later in this show. So I'm now honored to turn over to Julie to start this important Atlantic Council front page conversation. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being here. So that was quite an introduction. And again, thank you to the Atlantic Council for having us here for this important conversation. I can't think of anybody better to be here discussing Russia's ongoing campaign in Ukraine, its aggression against the Ukrainian people, men, children, women that we've seen so indiscriminately over the last few years. Ms. Matviichuk is a human rights lawyer with more than 20 years of experience doing this critical work in Ukraine. She leads the Center for Civil Liberties, a human rights organization founded in 2007. As you heard, Ms. Matviichuk and her partner received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. I should note it is the first time Ukraine has ever won this prize. And she was named one of the top 25 most influential women in the world by the Financial Times. So it is really an honor to have her here and to be able to pepper her with questions, I'm sorry in advance, just about her knowledge as we enter yet another critical year in this war, and we've seen so many developments in Washington and beyond when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine. So with that, when you first started 20 years ago and you started your work in human rights law, how different was it then or not?
I was interested in human rights defense when I was in school. Being a child, I got acquainted with Soviet dissidents. And suddenly, I appeared in a circle with people from a historical book. Fantastic people. People who say what they think and who do what they say. People who have bravery to stood up their voice against the whole totalitarian Soviet machine. People who had no other instruments but just their own words and their own position. People who were repressed, part of them were killed, part of them were subjected for forcible treatment in psychological hospitals. Majority of dissidents were imprisoned. Careers were ruined, families were separated, but they didn't stop. And because of their fight, I, being a child, had the knowledge that we restore our independence only because they're fighting. And I was so inspired by this example that I decided to myself to study law and to continue this fight for freedom and for justice. And I think what's similar is while I'm working today and from that period, the main lessons learned for ages is pretty the same, that when you can't rely on the legal instruments or international guarantees or UN system of peace and security, you can still rely on people. People matters, and ordinary people can have a much great impact that they can even imagine.
You talk about ordinary people often when you talk about achieving world peace. What can ordinary people do, right? What are some of the practical tools that people in the US watching, people around the globe, ordinary people, as you say, what can they do every single week, every single month to try and chip away at what we're seeing happening, not only in Ukraine, but worldwide?
Let me provide a concrete example. Because when Russia started large-scale invasion, not just Putin, but also our international partners were confident that Ukraine will fall just in 3 or 4 days because we have no capacity to resist to such enormous opposing power. And I was in Kiev at that time. I refused to evacuate while Russian troops tried to circle my city. And I and other people in Kiev, we witnessed how international organizations evacuated their personnel. But ordinary people remained. And ordinary people started to do extraordinary things. It were ordinary people who helped to survive anti-artillery fire. It were ordinary people who took people out from the ruined cities. It were ordinary people who broke through the encirclement to provide humanitarian aid. And suddenly, it became obvious that ordinary people fighting for their freedom and for their human dignity are stronger than even the second army in the world. And this is just a part of story, because it also were ordinary people in other countries. And I would use this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to people in the United States, in America, to people in other countries who are with us in these dramatic times of our history. Because we survived because of you. Because when large-scale wars started, ordinary people in different countries, they started to do something to stop Putin's war. They organized meetings, they hosted Ukrainian refugees, they made donations, they urged the government to provide Ukraine with weapons. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, because in Ukraine, we are fighting for freedom. And this is something which have no limitation in national borders. And this is something which make our world safer.
That was so powerfully said, and we'll talk more about the impact that the global community in the West has had on trying to help Ukraine, what its people have been doing on their own, really, throughout the last few years. I've spoken with a number of officials and NATO partners who, even 24 hours before Putin's full-scale invasion, didn't believe that it was going to happen. In your view, why do you think Putin made that decision, and do you think he's afraid of something?
I think that Putin is afraid of freedom. There are a lot of conversation about the roots of this war, but let's be clear. Putin started this war not because he is afraid of NATO. Putin started this war because he is afraid of freedom. Because after collapse of authoritarian regime in Ukraine, we people in Ukraine got our chance for the quick democratic transition. We got our chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And in order to stop us on this way, Russia invaded. Russia occupied Crimea, part of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and 2 years ago extended this war to the large-scale invasion. Because once again, Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom, which came closer to Russian borders. And why he allowed himself to do it? Because all this hell, which we now face in Ukraine, it's a result of total impunity, which Russia enjoyed for decades. Russian troops committed horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. Russia has never been punished. Russia believes they can do whatever they want. I remember that people asked me why Russians killed a family, mother and children, which trying to evacuate their family from the dangerous zone. They shooting the civilian car, while these Russians provide them a permission to go out from the dangerous zone and even wave, like expressing goodwill and good luck for future. And why they did it? Why they killed this mother and their family, their children? And I have only one answer, and this answer is very simple. Because they can. Because they can. Because they have never been punished for all these atrocities which they commit previously. Because when they started invasion in Ukraine and occupied Crimea, the response of international community was so weak that it just encouraged Putin to go further.
Do you believe that Putin is paying attention to the internal dynamics? Our elections are just a couple of weeks away. The fractures, especially within the Republican Party, on continuing to provide aid to Ukraine. Do you worry that that sends him the message that he can continue to act with impunity?
I have a huge respect to elections, which is going on in the United States, and it's independent right of citizens of United States to decide whom they want to elect their president. But what I want to say in this regard is only one thing. Regardless who will be a president of United States, Ukrainians will continue our fight for freedom. Because we have no other choice. Putin openly says that there is no Ukrainian nation, there is no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukrainian culture. We know Russian language, and we can closely follow Russian TV. They openly say that Ukrainians have to be either re-educated as Russians or killed. And for 10 years, we have been documenting how these words converted in horrible practice. When Russian troops physically exterminate active local people on the ground, mayors, journalists, children writers, musicians, teachers, environmentalists, any active people of community, how they ban Ukrainian language and culture and rope and damage Ukrainian cultural heritage, how they forcibly taken Ukrainian children to Russia in order to bring them up as Russians. So once again, to be clear, we have no other choice. If we stop fighting, it will be no more us.
Do you believe in a negotiated settlement? That is something that lawmakers on Capitol Hill are talking about, other leaders are discussing. What is a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia?
Before I answer this question, let me tell one important thing. I work with people affected by this war directly. So I know for sure that people in Ukraine want peace much more than anyone else. But peace doesn't come when country which was invaded stop fighting. That's not peace. That's occupation. And occupation, it's horrible. Occupation is just another form of the war. Occupation means that you live in gray zone, that you have no tools how to defend your rights, your freedom, your property, your life, your children, your beloved ones. Occupation is not just changing one state flag to another. Russian occupation means torture, rape, enforced disappearances, denial of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps, and mass graves. I spoke with hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity in occupied territories, men, women, civilians. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, their nails were drilled, they were electrically shocked through their genitalia. One woman told me how her eye was dug out with a spoon. There is no legitimate reason in doing such things. There is also no military necessity in it. Russians have done these horrible things only because they could. So occupation is just another form of the war. We need peace, and we are fighting for peace. And the problem is that Russia doesn't want peace. All these messages, all the signals which Putin disseminates is just a special operation to decrease the level of support of Ukraine and to make Russian task to occupy the country much more easier. Because let's return to the near past, when we have so-called peace agreement. How Russia uses these 8 years of peace agreement. They built powerful military base in Crimea. They prepared their economy for the new wave of sanctions. They retreat, they regroup, they produce artillery shells, and they started large-scale war. Because Russia is empire, and empire has a center, but has no borders. When empire has energy, empire always tries to expand. And that is why people who survived Russian captivity, they told us that Russians expressed their vision like this, that first, we will occupy Ukraine, and then, together with you, we will go to conquer in other countries.
That's a really important point you bring up, and I think we have to talk about propaganda and how Vladimir Putin is using that to convince maybe people in the West, people in these occupied territories, that they want to be Russia. I've heard from a lot of people in Washington and beyond who believe that those occupied territories, the people living there, want to be part of Russia. How has Putin been using propaganda to damage another layer of human rights in Ukraine?
I can answer to this question with one concrete example from a human rights work. Once I interviewed one young girl from Donetsk. She was illegally arrested and detained only because she has pro-Ukrainian sympathy, which is okay for citizens for Ukraine to have pro-Ukrainian sympathy. So it's not a crime at all. But still, she was arrested, and she was severely beaten with a metal stick. And she told me that she begged not to beat her because she was pregnant. And she was awaiting for a child. And she got response that because you have pro-Ukrainian sympathy, your child has no right to be born. But then they changed their mind and they told her, okay, we will release you if you will tell that you're a sniper. For sure, she agreed. She can tell that she is Batman, just to survive. So it was first time when she got clean clothes, and she learned by heart everything which she has to deliver to this so-called Russian journalist. And this Russian journalist arrived, and what shocked me the most in the story, that when this so-called Russian journalist arrived and saw her, they asked her to sit in a pose to hide her pregnancy because it ruined the whole plot that she's a sniper. So this is an example of Russian disinformation. And the problem is that this war has not just military dimension, but also informational dimension. And Putin is fighting for your minds and for your hearts. And he prepared for this fight. He invested billions of dollars to build a powerful informational infrastructure among the globe. And the truth is very weak. And for us to reveal the truth, it needs obligation for every person to stand up their voice.
Is Putin just playing the waiting game in this war? I mean, is he just waiting for democracies and the West to throw in the towel, to say, we can't help anymore, we've given enough? What do you think his endgame is here?
I think that for Russia and for Putin himself, Ukraine, it's not a goal. Ukraine is just a tool. Because this is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And with this war, Putin attempts to convince the entire world that democracy, rule of law, human rights, and freedom are fake values because they couldn't protect anyone during the war. He attempts to convince that the country with a strong military potential and nuclear weapon can break the world order, can dictate its rules to entire international community, and even forcibly changed internationally recognized borders. And if Putin succeeds, it will encourage other authoritarian leaders in the different parts of the globe to do the same. Because even using our example, we are dealing with the formation of entire authoritarian bloc. I live in Kiev, and my native city is constantly being shelled not just by Russian rockets, but also by Iranian drones. China helps Russia to circumvent sanctions and import technologies critical to warfare. North Korea sent to Russia more than 1 million artillery shells, and just recently we got news that they sent people to fight for Russia. Syria votes for Russia in UN General Assembly. So all these regimes which captured power in their countries, they have something in common. They have the same idea what human being is. They see a human being as an object of control. They deny people of rights and freedom. Democracies, in opposite, they see human rights and freedom and human being itself to be the highest value. There is no way to negotiate it because only existence of free world always provided threats to dictatorship, to lose their power. And that's why Ukraine is not just a goal, it's just a tool for Russia and for authoritarian alliance to break the world order. To break the world order and to change the rule of the game with force. And that is why it's dangerous for everyone, regardless where people live.
So do you think that Putin has had some success in trying to break the world order, in getting even closer to Iran, North Korea, and China, despite the West saying NATO has never been stronger, they've punished Putin or tried to with sanctions, and yet he keeps skirting by?
I think that he's successfully using the very visible problem. I don't know how historians in future will call this historical time, but the world order, which is based on UN Charter and international law, is collapsing before our eyes. And there is a clear reason for this, because current international system of peace and security was created in past century. And this system provided for certain countries irrational privileges. And now the work of Security Council is paralyzed. And that is why it's very easy to predict that such fires like wars will appear more and more often in different parts of the globe, because the whole international wiring is faulty and sparks are everywhere. And because we haven't started a cardinal reform of international system of peace and security, we have to do our job, because we have to restart this system, to build a system on human rights and freedoms, to provide a security to all people, regardless whether or not they live in a country with a strong military potential or whether or not their country is belong to some military bloc, and whether or not their country has oil and gas, and that's why all other countries will close their eyes for human rights violations, which is committing this regime against their own citizens.
Do you have any faith and any hope in these institutions, the UN, the International Criminal Court, whether it comes to Ukraine or now what we're seeing in the Middle East?
I have a hope, but hope is not a strategy. We need a strategy, and we need decisive action. And this is not first time in a human history when people find ourselves in situation when the law doesn't work. For example, me, I am a human rights lawyer. But when large-scale war started, I found myself that I have no legal instruments how to stop Russian atrocities. Russian troops shell in residential buildings, schools, churches, museums, and hospitals. They attack in evacuation corridors. They torture in people infiltration camps. They forcibly take in Ukrainian children to Russia. They abducting, robbing, raping, and killing civilians in the occupied territories. And the entire UN system of peace and security can't stop it. Let me remind you that in 2022, UN Court of Justice issued the decision and obliged Russia to immediately withdraw their troops from Ukraine. And Russia ignored even the decision of UN Court of Justice. So no surprise that when someone's asked me how to help to protect human rights and freedom in Ukraine, I have to answer, give Ukraine weapons. Give Ukraine weapons. And this is something which you probably don't expect to hear from the human rights lawyer, but this is reality. We have a right to self-defense, and it's very difficult to resist Russian aggression with the bare hands, because Russian killed unarmed. And that is why I once again repeat that we need weapons, and even more, we need permission to use these weapons to strike back to Russian military objects in their own territories, because it takes only 42 seconds for Russian rocket to hit school in Kharkiv. When you have just 42 seconds and your children in this school, you have a clear understanding that 42 seconds into less to go to bomb shelter, and probably in 42 seconds, your children will be killed. And that's why Ukraine needs permission to reach these rockets, to reach these drones, to reach these planes on the military fields in Russian territory.
As you said, there are multiple fires happening around the world now. You mentioned armed resistance, which I was surprised to hear you previously say it as a human rights lawyer, as somebody who wants and promotes world peace. The only hope for Ukrainians, in your view, is to pursue armed resistance. So my question to you is, zooming out of Ukraine, looking at the globe as a whole, when is armed resistance justified and when is it unacceptable?
We have a right to self-defense according to international law. And the law defined clearly the bunch of criteria when the force is legitimate and when the force is violate international law.
Sticking with the Middle East and authoritarian regimes, how do you think the West should respond and continue to respond in the Middle East, maybe having learned something from Russia's war in Ukraine? Do you see any parallels between these two wars now? Because obviously the West's attention is divided.
Probably it's a good opportunity to express my sincere solidarity with people who suffered in this war. Because we Ukrainians know what the war is about. We Ukrainians know what the human pain is about. And we know what does it mean when the whole international system of peace and security is not working properly. And probably I refer to my personal example. When large-scale war started, I received a letter from Syrian human rights defenders. And you know that the war in Syria is going on for years and years. And people every day being torturing, being sexually assaulting, being killed. And this is not news anymore. You can't find events from Syria in a front page or even from the second page in American and other media. And when large-scale war started, Syrian human rights defenders wrote me. They told, we are with you in solidarity because we know what the war is about. We know what the human pain is about. And also they wrote, please tell us, what do you need in your fight for justice? We'll do everything which we can because your fight, it's our fight. And I think that the right strategy for people who are suffering from war crimes and authoritarian regimes in different parts of the globe, it's not to compete with each other for attention. Because today's victims very easily will turn to tomorrow's victims. We live in a very dangerous world, and every time something is going on. The right strategy is to unite our efforts and start to repair this broken international system, start to help each other in our fight for justice. Because Ukraine can be a precedent to change a global approach to crime against peace globally. What do I mean? If we want to prevent wars in the future, we have to punish the states and their leaders who start such wars in present. This is a common sense, but in the whole history of humankind, we have only one such a precedent. It was Nuremberg trials, when Nazi war criminals were tried only after Nazi regime had collapsed. But we live in a new century, which means that we cannot wait. Justice must be independent on when and how the war will end. We have to establish a special tribunal on aggression now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and other war criminals accountable. And this precedent will be used for other parts of the globe in future.
I spoke to a member of Ukraine's parliament a couple of months ago about another very serious human rights crisis that you have going on in Ukraine, which is that a lot of people who left the country are afraid to come back. Part of the reason is because you're still being shelled all the time. There's landmines covering a third of Ukraine. Do you think Ukraine will ever be able to recover from the people that it lost?
Let me express from the human point of view what the danger is about. In December 2022, I found myself in a flat without heating, electricity, light, water, internet connection, and then even mobile connection was disappeared. And my husband brought 2 bricks to the kitchen, and I looked to him and asked him, honey, what are you doing? Why you bring these 2 bricks to our kitchen. And he told, you see, we have the gas oven, and I will try to experiment. I will try to warm these bricks and see how long these bricks will give warm back. And I looked to all this stuff and thought, oh my God, I feel that I live in Middle Ages. Because winter is very cold in Ukraine. You can't survive in winter in Ukraine without heating, light, electricity, water, just with 2 bricks. It's impossible. And now Russia destroyed the vast majority of energy regeneration system in Ukraine. This means that we will expect even harder winter this year. This means that we will not be able to close our sky, to reach these rockets in planes, which continue to destroy residential buildings and other energy and civil infrastructure in Ukraine. We will expect more millions of people will leave Ukraine just nearest months. Because when you have winter and you have no heating, but you have a task how to warm the milk for newborn baby, and you have responsibility to make your newborn baby to survive.
So given what you just said and the bleak picture that you paint about a winter that is just a couple of weeks away, what is your message to the West? What should they keep doing?
I told on the beginning how Ukrainians are grateful for everything and every support which we receive from United States and from other democratic partners. But the truth is that we need decisive actions. And there are plenty of things which has to be done. I just mentioned during our conversation the possibility to use American weapons to strike back to military facilities in Russian Federation. The possibility to use Russian frozen money for self-defense and for recovery of Ukraine. The possibility to close this back door, which Russia used in order to violate sanction regimes. We still find in planes and drones the elements from American companies, from Germany companies, from Switzerland companies. So there are a lot of things which has to be done. But probably what the main which we need to set a common goal. What do I mean? When large-scale war started, the civilized world told, let's help Ukraine not to fail. And Ukraine obtained the first weapons to be able to defend ourselves. And first real sanctions against Russia were introduced into force. And once again, we're extremely grateful because it helped us to survive. But it's also an explanation why Ukraine was waiting for a first modern tank for more than a year. Why Ukraine was waiting for a first modern plane for more than 2 years. Because we have to change this narrative. There is a huge difference between let's help Ukraine not to fail and let's help Ukraine to win. And America and other democratic partners, they have capacity to help Ukraine to win. We just have to set this common goal.
So what does a victory for Ukraine look like?
It's a good question because I design victory very ambitiously. Let me remind how this war was started. This war was started after Revolution of Dignity. And what it was, Revolution of Dignity? It was a time when millions of Ukrainians stood up their voice against pro-Russian, corrupt, and authoritarian governments. And they bravely demonstrated just for a chance to build a country with democratic institutions. So for me personally, victory for Ukraine is to succeed in democratic transition and to win this value dimension of this war. And this is visible. It's not just abstract things, it's very practical things. For example, when I ask my Russian human rights colleagues, who always help us, now we have thousands of illegally detained civilians in Russia. And for us, the only way how to do something is the hands of our brave Russian colleagues. And they face enormous persecution in Russia itself. You know that human rights organizations were banned. Part of my colleagues have to leave Russia. Part of my colleagues were jailed. Part still working under the constant threats to be killed or arrested. So when I asked them, how we can help you, they always answered, if you want to help us, please be successful. Because only success of Ukraine provides a chance for democratic future of Russia itself. Not a guarantee, but there is no guarantee in our life at all, but a chance, and believe me, it is a luxury to have a chance.
Can there be world peace if the UN remains looking like it is now with Russia and China and authoritarian regimes at the table?
I'm not a person who predict future. Future is unclear, but future is also not pre-written. And I'm a person who trying with my own efforts to create a future which we want for ourselves and for our children. And I'm glad to know that I'm not alone. There are a lot of people who also feel this responsibility, that we have to do something with this international system. We have to stop evil because unpunished evil grows. We have to stop dictators because the logic of dictators always the same, and Putin will stop only when he will be stopped. People who know that when you can't rely on the legal instruments, you can still rely on people. And these dramatic times, it's a test for individual leadership, for individual courage, for individual responsibility.
That was so well said. I just want to remind everyone that we're going to have some questions in a couple of minutes. For those of you watching at home, you can go to askac.org to submit your questions online. We'll be starting that in a few minutes. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you really wanted to share or make a point of or highlight before we move into this next portion?
I think it's very important in all this sharp geopolitical debates about Russian war against Ukraine not to lose human dimension. Because it's very easy to speak about politics, and it's always hard when you start to speak about people. So I will use this opportunity to tell you a story of 14-year-old Sofia from Mariupol. When Russian troops tried to siege the city, they didn't provide a permission for International Committee of Red Cross to evacuate civilians. And that's why Sofia, her brother, and her younger sister, together with mother, had to hide in the basement of their residential building. And one day, they were bombarded by Russian plane. And the residential building was destroyed. And her brother died immediately. And she expressed how she was scared, how she has no other tools but just her own hands, and how she, with her own hands, tried to clean the rubble, to provide opportunity for her mother just to breathe. And only then she ran for help, but her mother died, and they had to bury her mother in the garden near the former residential building. And when I hear such stories, I told to myself that something wrong in this world. something wrong with us, with adults, that 40-year-old children have to try to dig their mother from rubbles from residential buildings and bury their mother in their own garden.
It's a really heavy story, and you make a point often to say these are not just numbers, these are people. This is happening to people. And I think we could all learn a lot about humanity just from listening to you, so thank you so much for sharing that. We have about 29 seconds until we move on to questions. I think we can probably get going. Let's see if anything. Okay, we have a lot online, so if anybody has a question in the room, walk over to the microphone right there on my right, your left if you're facing the screen, if you're facing the stage, and we'll take your question first, and if not, we'll take one from the site. Okay, we'll get one warmed up from the website. Okay, we have a question from Norway. Seeing how Russia has ignored international law, humanitarian law systematically for many years, do you think those responsible in the Kremlin will ever be brought to justice? And if so, how may that happen short of a total collapse of the Russian state?
When large-scale war started, we united our efforts with dozens of organizations from different regions. We built a national network of local documentators. We covered the whole country, including the occupied territories. And we had an ambitious goal to document each criminal episode which was committed in the smallest village in each oblast in Ukraine. And working together, we jointly documented more than 80,000 episodes of war crimes. And 80,000 is a huge amount, but it's just a tip of iceberg. And this is something which we documented, which we will use in international and national court to hold Russian war criminals accountable. And let's remind that international crimes has no statute of limitation. And let's remind that authoritarian regime collapsed and the leaders who see themselves untouchable appeared under the court. The last example in our part of the globe, it was Milosevic. Serbia didn't want to transfer Milosevic to The Hague, but Serbia did.
Does anyone have any questions from the audience? You could just sit if that's easier.
I'll go to the mic.
Oh, okay, great.
That was a powerful presentation, and I thank you for it. I don't want to speak for everybody here, but I suspect many people share my appreciation. My question is this. You spoke of victory, and speaking personally, I'd like to see the Russians out of every inch of Ukrainian territory, and maybe a more democratic Russia in the wake of Russia's failure of aggression. But Putin wants to destroy Ukraine, the Ukrainian nation in total. You've said so. I think he said so. And I think your observation is accurate. Is it also a sort of victory if the Ukrainian nation survives despite Putin's attempts at destroying it? Is that also a victory?
I think it's also a matter of justice. It's a matter of justice because people in Ukraine for centuries was fighting with Russian Empire.
Fair enough.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
I'll take one. There has been a lot of talk, especially in this town, about the potential for a negotiated solution. In your opinion and in your understanding, what would actually convince Putin to stop his attempts to destroy Ukraine?
It's a very good question because, like, when we hear this talks that let's put Ukraine and Russia to sit on the one table and to negotiate, the supporters of this idea unfortunately have no tools how to make Russia to stop. And like this make all this discussion into wishful thinking. And wishful thinking is very dangerous for people who are dying. We can't afford ourselves wishful thinking.
In that vein, I'll take one from the website from our viewers who are watching at home, who say, what do you think about the recent calls for peace? And what conditions are necessary for a just and fair peace for Ukraine and Ukrainians? I've asked you this, you've heard it from the audience. Clearly this is something that is being talked about here.
Like Putin can end this war in a minute. In a minute. It's just decision of Russia to withdraw their troops from Ukraine.
Does anyone have any further questions?
I wanted to ask a question related to the fact that you have set some new precedents here for women. You've done things that women haven't been able to do before and won this wonderful award and so forth. What do you think the role for women can be to push Russia in the right direction and to help Ukraine in a way that it hasn't been helped, and even for American women? We have the real possibility here of having a woman president and so forth. Can this be something that leads to a wave of public support and public understanding and public help as we see it in our politics potentially and as you've seen it in your life?
Thank you for this question, because it provides me opportunity to speak about the role of Ukrainian women in this war. And when journalists ask me this question, I always hesitated what to answer, because I know a lot of fantastic women in different fields of society. Ukrainian women are joined Ukraine armed forces. Ukrainian women take important political decisions. Ukrainian women document war crimes. Ukrainian women coordinate civil initiatives. Ukrainian women are in the forefront of this battle for freedom and for democracy, because bravery has no gender. And from this gender perspective, it's very visible, this value dimension of this war. Because in democracies, women can perform any role she wants for her in family and society. But in autocracy, women can perform only a assigned role for her in family and society. And this is a basis for the authoritarian regime, because established relationship between people and society always reflects the society's idea of what government can do towards its own people. And that is why in Norway, men and women have equal rights. And that is why in Afghanistan, women are prohibited to study in school, in universities, and now even to speak publicly and when men can hear them. And that is why in Russia, even domestic violence is decriminalized, because once again, it's always just a projection how government behave toward its own citizens. And that is why we Ukrainian women in this war with Russia, we are fighting for our daughters. We want our daughters will never face a situation that they have to prove someone that they are also a human beings.
Alexandra, thank you very much for your powerful speech. My name is Katerina. I'm from Chernihiv city that was also sieged in 2022. And now, as me and many Ukrainians live in the US, I have many Russian friends who immigrated to different countries because they do not support the regime, and whose families still live in Russia and also do not support the regime. So my question is, how can people who are against the Russian war against Ukraine to help Ukrainians within Russia, and how can they show their support and be against the war?
Thank you for this question. Frankly speaking, I always get these questions in different audiences, and people ask how we can help you. And what I notice that people who ask this question have already done a lot to help us. And I start to reflect about the situation and suddenly understood that they ask me another question. Their real question, what they ask me, how we can stop this war. Because when you face with a war, it's an enormous challenge. And everything which you are doing in order to help can seem with no sense, can seem very modest. The truth is that there is no modest efforts. The truth is that all efforts matters. And it's okay to feel that we are human beings faced with a war. We are not gods, which means that we can't stop this war with our individual efforts. But without our efforts, nothing will be stopped. And I remind myself that once we had this feeling, it was during the Revolution of Dignity. I was coordinator of civil initiative Euromaidan SOS, and every day, hundreds and hundreds of people who were beaten, arrested, tortured, accused in fabricated criminal cases passed through our care. And that was time when paramilitary group Titushki cooperated with police. Police cooperate with prosecutors, with court, the former president, former government, security service, the majority of parliament were against people. They want to liquidate peaceful protest, even physically. And people start to feel the learned helplessness. Because what you can do when the all state bodies designed to protect your rights try to kill you. And in order to counteract this feeling, Ukrainian artists made a series of beautiful posters and widely distributed. And on one poster, they drawn the drop. And it was a title, "We are drop of the ocean." Which means that yes, we are human beings. We are not gods. And there is no security. There is no confidence in the future. But together, we are drop in the ocean. And the ocean can change the history.
I would love for everyone to give a round of applause for our This has been such a privilege for me to be able to sit here and ask you these questions, for you to be able to contextualize this terrible, terrible war so eloquently from a human rights angle that I think is often missing in these conversations. So thank you. Thank you so much to our audience for your thoughtful questions. I think you really helped drive this conversation forward, and everyone watching at home as well. Thank you so much for tuning in.